that was sent for this very occasion. On July 26, 2020, we marked 30 years since the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was signed into law with the promise of fostering full and equal access to civic, economic, and social life for individuals with disabilities. And the ADA bans discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, state and local government services, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportations, and communications. The passage of the ADA was the culmination of decades of advocacy, community organizing, and activism by thousands of Americans who challenged the barriers that excluded and segregated people with disabilities from full participation and inclusion in community life. For 1 in 5 North Carolinians who is born with or will acquire a disability during their lifetime, the ADA establishes the expectation that they are fully able to participate in our society and economy. The state of North Carolina embraces the principles embodied in the ADA and renews our commitment to eliminating barriers to inclusion and full participation in our communities and economy. To increase opportunity for fair wages, career employment, and economic self-sufficiencies for individuals with disabilities, Executive Order 92 declares North Carolina an employment first state and directs the Office of State Human Resources to transform state government into a model employer of people with disabilities. And on July 26, our state and nation will commemorate the 30th anniversary of Americans with Disabilities Act, celebrating the progress that has been made while recognizing the struggle for equal access and inclusion. And Governor Roy Cooper did declare July 26, 2020 as Americans with Disabilities Day Act in North Carolina. I just went over the proclamation again that was sent by Governor Cooper to celebrate this very momentous landmark legislation that occurred from the ADA. I am also very pleased to be here to be the facilitator for this Lunch and Learn. And I would like to do some housekeeping right now. Please make sure that you keep your phones on mute so that our microphones on mute so that we are able to hear our speaker today. If you have questions, you can go to the chat icon and send all of your questions to either Regina Streety, who is our other diversity and inclusion consultant, or to me, Wendy Wills, and we will make sure that your question is answered during the question and answer segment of our Lunch and Learn. At this time, I would like to turn our program over to Jennifer Mizrahi. She's going to be our speaker for our Lunch and Learn this morning, and we're very excited to have her and have her share about her experience with the ADA and her celebration of the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. At this time, I would like to present to you Jennifer Mizrahi. Jennifer?
Wendy, it is such a pleasure to be with you and your colleagues today. I feel completely honored to be a part of this ADA celebration. I was born and raised in Durham, North Carolina, where my mother's living in a retirement community. My brother is a public employee, battalion chief of a fire department in Greensboro, North Carolina, and my nieces are in North Carolina public schools. And so the work that you do as human resource officers for the state of North Carolina could not be more important to me. And so your success is really, really important. And I hope to be able to give you some concrete ideas. I myself am dyslexic and I have ADHD. I'm 56 years old, so I was born before the Americans with Disabilities Act. They did not diagnose my disabilities until I was 14. So people thought that I was frankly rambunctious and not trying very hard in school. I was trying very, very hard in school and failing. When you don't have a disability diagnosis and you're a student, it can be deeply, deeply frustrating Today, that still happens, particularly in communities of color, where that is a real challenge because structural racism has meant that we pay for school with property taxes, and in areas where the income is less, there are not the special educators, the mental health supports, and others that are needed for so many North Carolinian children with disabilities. But I want to really focus on your workforce for the state of North Carolina, and I'd like to walk through some slides. So Wendy, if you don't mind sharing the slides on the screen, I'd love to share them because I want to give you some concrete advice on how you can enable people with disabilities who work for you to really thrive and to help your communities do so well in the future. So first of all, I'm the president of Respectability. We're a nonprofit organization that fights stigmas and advances opportunities for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. And you heard a little bit about me. If you want to know more, you can click on my bio later. I think everyone's going to get the slides. Next. It's very important when you think about inclusion and equity to recognize that there's all kinds of equity. As a child, I do remember in North Carolina segregation that was very overt by race. I remember going to the beach and seeing a sign in Smithfield that said, "Welcome to Smithfield, welcome to Klan country." And I know that some progress has been made on racial justice issues, but that we have a long way to go. I think all of these movements for equity need to really lock arms and help each other. Next slide. And we need to think about a system that works for the people that we're trying to serve. This is a boardroom that we would have seen in the past, and it's all white men. The fact is that the majority, a slight majority of North Carolinians are women. So why would you have a board or a leadership team that doesn't include women? You also have significant numbers of people of color. Why wouldn't there be people of color? But when you're talking about adults, 1 out of every 4, according to the CDC, has a disability. The older you get, the more likely you are to have a disability. Next slide, please. Next, please. There are many barriers to people with disabilities. This is my friend and colleague, Tatiana Lee, who is an African-American woman trying to get into a building. There is no accessible entrance to this building. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 30 years ago, but still many buildings are not accessible. One of the folks who's on this call sent in a question in advance because Senator Orrin Hatch did an op-ed this week talking about quote unquote frivolous lawsuits around disability or drive-by lawsuits. Yes, there are still lawsuits because there are still businesses and organizations that are not accessible. They've had 30 years with which to get accessible. We're now celebrating 30 years of a law that should be implemented. People should not have barriers to coming in. I will also say that frequently when we're going to an event, we check in advance to see if my colleague Tatiana or my other colleagues who use wheelchairs can get into the building, and they say yes. When we get there, we find out that that is the entrance used for dumpsters, and that my colleagues with wheelchairs need to come in the back by the dumpsters to get into an event. That is not equity. Next slide, please. Next, please. Organizations, all organizations, including state government, are at their best when they welcome, respect, and include people of all backgrounds. That includes people from the LGBTQ community, people of color, men, women, old, young, and of course, people with disabilities. Next slide, please. However, when people talk about disability, or diversity, they frequently leave out disability. And frequently, let's go back that slide, please. These are faces of people with disabilities. One of the things that people don't recognize is that some of the most talented people on earth are people with disabilities. So if you are not accessible, you might be leaving out the most talented person who could help your office and your team. For example, Stephen Hawking was unlocking the secrets of the universe from a wheelchair. Harriet Tubman, who did so much to free slaves, she had epilepsy. Thomas Edison, one of the greatest inventors of all times, he was deaf. If you want to have a team that is really successful, you want to have people with disabilities in the room helping your team. Next slide, please. There are 61 million people in America with disabilities. As I mentioned, that's 1 in every 4 adults. That means that there are people that you're working with every day that have disabilities already. One key, though, is that you might not know that they have disabilities. Next slide, please. Because there's a lot of stigma and therefore a lot of shame around disability. So frequently people don't, quote unquote, come out of the closet, much like people from the LGBTQ community in the past have not been willing to self-disclose because of fear of shame and prejudice. Disabilities can be temporary and they can be permanent. So, for example, as you age, you can be in an accident, you can get cancer or diabetes, you can acquire mental health conditions, which many people are acquiring right now during this pandemic. In fact, I am sure that a significant portion of your employees today are living with some sort of traumatic stress because of what is going on today, either because of the pandemic or if they are a Black American, seeing George Floyd or Breonna Taylor on TV is completely triggering and upsetting, and rightfully so, and it is causing mental health conditions, rightfully so. And so dealing with that in the workforce is very important. The majority of disabilities are not visible, like my learning disabilities, like mental health conditions. They can be acquired or they can be from birth. Next slide, please. Disability impacts everyone. I encourage you to go to this slide on your own time later because each of these links go to different subgroups of demographics that highlights people with disabilities who are also very, very successful. Next slide, please. Anyone can join the disability community at any time, again, because of accident, aging, or illness. So if you're running an office, you may have noticed that you have employees who have new disabilities because of the times that we are in. So for example, they may have mental health conditions and they may need to have a focus on wellness that you can put into the system for your employees. For example, having some ideas of simple exercises, yoga, or mindfulness that people can do at home. Having access to online mental health supports can be incredibly helpful in this time, recognizing that sometimes people need flex time and that they do need to take vacation for their mental health, even if they're not going anywhere other than their spare bedroom because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. There's 7 million students with disabilities in public school. A slight majority of them are children of color. I will also say that in America, 740,000 of the students with disabilities are English language learners. For immigrants with disabilities, there are unique challenges, multiple barriers, double if not triple discrimination. And so focusing on those issues is very important because sometimes when someone is a child, if they're not learning, it might be an invisible disability like mine, dyslexia, but if their parents speak Spanish at home, the teachers might think that it's not a disability, it's just because their parents don't speak English. This is going to be a real problem in schools as we're dealing with distance learning. This is really challenging. How do you diagnose a disability in a child when they're not even in your classroom? Only 65% of students with disabilities are currently completing high school. And I will say that only 7% are completing college. That 7% tends to almost all be from white two-parent families of relative educational and financial privilege. So it is very important to up our game in terms of fighting against this marginalization, particularly for people of color with disabilities who face so many barriers. Next slide, please. Only 1 in 3 people with disabilities have a job. And this is pre-COVID, but since COVID started, 20% of people with disabilities lost their jobs. This is particularly true in communities of color, where almost half of Black men with disabilities have lost their jobs in the pandemic. And it will be very important in your economic recovery plans to recognize this element and to prepare for it so that you have access to distance work for people who have underlying health conditions, which in many cases are non-visible, like heart condition, asthma, diabetes, etc. Next slide, please. There are many people with disabilities who are really talented, who are ready to help your organizations and your agencies. All of these are young adults with different disabilities, many of them invisible. All of them are incredibly talented. This is a pre-COVID poster photo, obviously, because no one's wearing a mask. Next photo, please. Next slide, please. So where can you find your local disability data? There is, believe it or not, a website that will tell you down to the county level how many people with disabilities are in your county, what kinds of disabilities they have. I find that incredibly helpful. So you can look at the links here and find your hyperlocal information about the people you need to be serving. Next slide, please. You want to be sure that when you're trying to solve problems for people with disabilities, that you're asking the people with disabilities themselves, because they know the solutions that work best for them, and they really want to be helpful. So we call that nothing about us without us. Next slide, please. You don't want to solve problems for people with disabilities. You want to solve them with people with disabilities. It's authentic representation. One thing that's interesting is that there have been some large-scale studies that show that organizations that have really active and smart policies around including people with disabilities, they actually make more money in the private sector and they're more successful than their peers. So companies that have really active engagement of people with disabilities, like Walmart, like Bank of America, like JP Morgan Chase, and some of the others, they outperform other companies that don't have active inclusion programs. And that is also true for state governments. We've seen some great programs in Minnesota and in Delaware and other places. Next slide, please. In terms of voters with disabilities, it'll be very important to make sure that there is access to voting for people with disabilities. It's a lot of push for people to be able to vote from home because of the pandemic. But also people who are blind will need a way to vote as well, because a mailer for someone who's blind isn't going to work. So you want to be sure that your voting is set up to be accessible in the state of North Carolina. Next slide, please. This is a large-scale study of nonprofit organizations, and you can read it on your own time. Oh, and next slide, please. What's interesting about that is that, first of all, 12% of jobs are with nonprofit organizations. These are how we went about the study. Next slide, please. But what we found was that 75% of nonprofits want to include people with disabilities. They say they have an active policy to include people with disabilities. But in fact, you see this problem that 40% of these nonprofits weren't even making sure that their annual big events were in a location that someone who's a wheelchair user can use. Additionally, one of the most important things for online work is captions. If you take your videos, for example, and put them on YouTube, YouTube has an algorithm that will instantly and for free put captions on your videos. My favorite price, free. My favorite time frame, instant. Yes, they make mistakes and they garble some of the words, but free and instant is pretty good. But only 14% of nonprofit organizations were even bothering to ensure captions on their videos. This is incredibly important. So true for Zoom calls if somebody requests captioning. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk you through just some simple steps that can help you be accessible. Let's go to the next slide, please. The first is that you should commit publicly within your agencies to the inclusion of people with disabilities, like Governor Cooper did in his acknowledgement of the ADA yesterday. It's a terrific statement, and it's really important to showcase those kinds of things in state government. Next slide, please. The second thing is to ensure that people with disabilities are at the table. We always say that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I really feel that that is true. You need to have people who are impacted by your policies and practice, part of the decision making, to give you guidance on what works and what doesn't work. Next slide, please. You want to foster an inclusive environment by using appropriate lexicon. There's a new lexicon now that we no longer call people African American. According to the new AP guide, we call people Black Americans with a capital B. You have to keep up with the language. Well, there's language for disability too. Most people use person first language. Some people use identity first language. But here is a link for what the appropriate lexicon is at the moment. Next slide, please. You also want to be sure that you're using the right sentences. So you don't say, for example, that somebody is wheelchair bound. Why? Because you're not strapped to a wheelchair. You're actually, a wheelchair is an element of liberation because it's how you get around if you are mobility impaired. If you don't know what the right lexicon is, ask somebody. If you don't know what accommodations that they need, ask somebody. We call it ATP. Ask the person. Don't guess on their behalf. Just ask them if they need an accommodation. What will help them perform better in your work environment? What will help them deliver the goods in terms of their talent for your organization's needs? Next slide, please. You want to, as I mentioned, work with people with disabilities. So I'm going to show you right here a couple of websites that are going to help you a lot. So first of all, you can go on our website, Respectability. By the way, we're having an ADA celebration. We have 2 hours of amazing programming every day this week from 1 o'clock until 3 o'clock, and it's free every single day, including a section on workforce later in the week that I think you would find very, very relevant. So you can check out the events on the Respectability website. But you really want to look at Tapability, where you can source talent with disabilities, or if you know someone with a disability who's looking for a job, they should get their resume on that website so that employers who are looking for disabled talent can find them there. By the way, federal contractors have an obligation to try and have at least 7% of their workforce in all job categories be people with disabilities. So there specifically is a demand for disabled talent amongst your federal contractors. I always encourage state government to do the same with your state contractors. When you're looking at how do you deal with an accommodation and what is expected and how do you communicate about when to disclose your disability, et cetera, you want to look at AskJan.org. AskJan.org is part of the government's program to offer free resources to HR managers like yourself, whether you can go on with almost any question and they have an FAQ, frequently asked questions, and if they don't have the information already on the website, you can email them and they'll get you the answer, and it's free and it's right there. Next slide, please. The next is just to recognize the case that people with disabilities, they're constantly facing barriers. A disability is a barrier to everyday living. You're hitting that barrier all the time. And so as a person with a disability, you're constantly pivoting. You're always innovating. So if you want to have innovative people on your team, you want to have people with disabilities because they're constant innovators in their lives, and that brings a lot of good stuff to the team. We also see that people with disabilities in corporations, if not in the public sector, they're more loyal to their employers, which means that once they learn the job, they're not going to quit on you and hop someplace else. Next slide, please. You want to have an inclusion point person in your office, and it should be in HR. There should be somebody with a lot of expertise on this, or at least willingness to get on the phone or the internet with AskJan.org. So it's very clear, where do you go if you need a disability inclusion or accommodation. Every one of your employees should know who is the point person to request an accommodation. And once you make an accommodation, that's a private piece of information. You don't put out, an email saying, hey, Joey has acquired a mental health condition and Joey is requesting that he can take off early every Wednesday so that he can see a psychiatrist. No, that's private information. You might let people know that Joey has a flex schedule, so he comes in earlier on Tuesdays and he leaves earlier on, and he leaves a little earlier on Wednesdays. but their issue about their accommodation and their disability is confidential information. Next slide, please. You want to also, in all of your front-facing marketing, particularly on your website, because people aren't going outside to offices as much, you want to have people with disabilities on your website. It really shows that you're inclusive in your society. Next slide, please. You want your website to be accessible for screen readers. That's a whole process. We have webinars on how to do it. By the way, there's lots of links on these slides. And where there are links on these slides, it's generally to webinars that are free that will show you how to do any and all of these things. We have free training for any and all of these things. They're all online. Next slide, please. You want your office and your events to be accessible to people with mobility impairments, and all of that. Again, all those checklists are on those lists, and so you can download them, and they're all free. Next slide, please. The Chicago Community Trust also put out a very nice toolkit that I recommend to people for these kinds of resources. Next slide, please. And you want to try and use vendors that hire people with disabilities or disability-owned businesses. Those can be very helpful. Next slide. And you want to be sure that you are always trying to promote people with disabilities also into their careers to move up. It's not just about hiring people with disabilities, it's enabling them to really succeed and to grow in their careers with you. Next slide. The Ford Foundation is an organization that used to be very, very terrible on these issues, and now they're great on these issues. They've done it in a very, very fast period of time. And so they're a really nice case study if you want to see who else has done it. Next slide, please. So the takeaway is really that organizations are at their best when they welcome, respect, and include people of all backgrounds, including people with disabilities, and that problems are best solved by working with people who have experienced them firsthand and know the solutions that work. Just like issues that impact people of different racial, ethnic, and other backgrounds, people with disabilities should be involved in solving issues that impact them. Next slide, please. This is a link that will go to all kinds of training. So again, you can go to our webinars and you can get training in all these different issues. All of it is free and it's all there 24/7. Next slide. And this is our philanthropy toolkit. And so if you have any more questions, hopefully the answers are there, or you can email me. But listen, I'm ready to take your questions. So if you want to close the PowerPoint slides, I'm very, very happy to try and answer whatever questions that you have. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm in such appreciation for the work that you do.
Anyone has questions, feel free to send them in the chat. Meanwhile, I'll ask a few that we do have. Jennifer, regarding the ADA, what does the law have yet to accomplish, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, like any law, it's only as good as people's willingness to really, make sure that people are paying attention to it. So, people are supposed to be able to get into restaurants and into stores, and you can't always do that. In fact, many cases you can't do that. I will also say that there were a lot of compromises 30 years ago. It's interesting, Senator Hatch, who wrote this email, this op-ed that was published yesterday, saying that there's too many lawsuits around the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was one of the leaders 30 years ago in passing the ADA. But at that time, one of the challenges was that the Catholic Church, frankly, didn't want to have gay people working for them in their schools. And AIDS is a disability. And so the ADA actually, to get enough votes for it to pass, it exempted all faith-based organizations. Interestingly, faith-based organizations are some of the least inclusive and accessible because they are exempted from the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is quite ironic because these are organizations that are very well intended. But think about it, if you go into a church, a lot of people are thinking about getting closer to God. And so to get closer to God, the idea is you're going up. So you'll have this magnificent stairway going into a church. And frequently, the only way to get into said church for someone who's a wheelchair user is by the garbage dump. So there's a lot of issues around the ADA. One of the key issues is that it was supposed to help people with disabilities get into the workforce. There has been significant improvement in terms of jobs for people with disabilities, but that improvement is not nearly enough because only about a third of people with disabilities pre-pandemic who were working age had jobs. That compares to over 70% of working age people without disabilities. So clearly, in educational attainment and in employment, we have a very, very far way to go.
Thank you. There's always heavy emphasis on diversity and inclusion training in the workplace, but very little, if any, in most businesses on disability awareness training or disability sensitivity training. Why do you think that is? And aside from offering the training, what do you think can be done to make this type of training as mainstream as the others?
Well, we're trying to get out the word and offer as much free training as possible. But I will tell you that one of the biggest barriers has been that people with disabilities are still in the closet. And so they don't want to ask for accommodations or educate about it because then they'd be quote unquote outing themselves. Think about it. Stonewall, major LGBTQ innovations and protests, that was more than 50 years ago. The March on Washington, where John Lewis at age 23 was the youngest speaker. By the way, I'm very proud that I supported his campaign as a college student in 1986, and I was one of his first interns in his first congressional office in 1986-87. That was 50 years ago, the March on Washington. The ADA is only 30 years old, so we're 20 years behind. Now, think about racial justice and how terrible things still are after 50 years. There is so much work to be done on equity. The disability community also is frequently fragmented. The disability organizations tend to be single disability, like a blindness organization or an autism organization or spina bifida organization. Respectability as an organization is trying to combine the impacts and the strengths of all of those communities because 1 out of every 5 people in our nation has a disability. And we're also trying to be very, very intersectional around race and gender identity and orientation, something that has not been done in the disability community to the extent needed in the past. As somebody with white and other privilege, I recognize that there has been structural racism even within the disability movement, and that we have a long way to go on some of these issues in our movement as well. So it's important for us to really lock arms and work together. Thanks for that great question.
I want to piggyback on what you just said. What strategy would you recommend to encourage individuals to self-ID, those with hidden disabilities or reasons that they don't want to disclose?
Right. So there's a lot of things that you can do. One is that when you have people in senior management who self-disclose, a lot is done by storytelling and sort of corporate communications that HR can do, where you feature successful employees in state government and how they're dealing with this pandemic, for example, and you destigmatize it. So let me just give you an example. So you have a very large number of your employees right now who are dealing with really acute mental health issues. So if you can have senior leadership within your state government talk about how they're handling mental health. What are they doing in the morning to do some form of exercise or mindfulness or listening to music? What are they doing in the afternoon after work, perhaps to go for a walk? How are they handling the isolation, whether it's talking with friends or family on the phone or on Zoom or whatever? Role modeling what people are doing to try and keep connections to other people, trying to keep their physical and mental health is very, very important. People don't need to come out and say, hey, I'm bipolar, for example. But pretty much you have this huge number of people who are dealing with stress. I will tell you that respectability as an employer, we're trying to model this in staff meetings. We frequently will start staff meeting on Zoom, which we do to have a personal face-to-face contact. We do all of our staff meetings on Zoom to try and help people reduce the isolation. But we frequently start by saying, hey, who has done something great? And it might say, hey, I watched this film on Netflix, or I went for a walk, or I talked to this person or that person, to have some sort of way of dealing with the mental health stuff and to normalize that people are going through some stressful moments right now. We have also out of pocket, because it's very hard to find mental health support that have the cultural competency for people of color. And unfortunately, we use a health insurance plan, Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is a very good health insurance plan, but not enough of their providers are mental health providers of color. And so we're paying out of pocket for people of color on our staff who are dealing with the mental health of racism and the pandemic concurrently, because we believe that if you're African American, well, now called Black American, sorry, I got to use the updated lexicon, and you're dealing with this strength and these issues, we want to be sure that you're able to bring your authentic, full, successful self to work. And we as an organization have found that it's worth helping them have access to Black mental health providers. They are very hard to find. One thing you can do is on Zoom is you can have conversations about wellness and about how you're dealing with the environment, the racial dynamic on Zoom with a facilitator who's a person of color who has expertise in those things. I think that people have to, it's not a disability to be completely freaked out by what we are seeing in the world around us. It is just a reality. And if we want our staff to perform as their best, we have to treat them as the human beings that they are. And it is impossible to disengage from the world and not know that bad things are happening. So we have to support, in my view, people through this crisis with these sorts of supports. Yeah, next question.
Thank you. In your experience, what are examples of innovative approaches that were taken to create work for people with disabilities? You just recently named some organizations that are doing this kind of work, and I'm thinking of initiatives that aim to create work for people with disabilities versus adhering to existing job functions that are harder to staff with workers with disabilities.
Right, so my two favorites, which are national organizations, are Project Search and Bridges to Work. They're dealing with people coming out of school and into the workforce, that very important transition from school to work. Project Search is my utter favorite. Project Search takes 12 young people with disabilities who are not diploma bound in high school. These may be people whose IQs are only 70. They have a significant intellectual disability. Maybe they have some other forms of disabilities, and people have frequently written these people off. And on average, only about 15% of these folks will ever be employed. Indeed, many of them will drop out and enter the school to prison pipeline. If you look at who's incarcerated in America, we're talking about people of color with disabilities who were in under-resourced schools. Their disabilities were not diagnosed or addressed in school, and they didn't have an access to a program like Project Search. Project Search will take a dozen of these young people at a time to a job site. Typically, they're working in hospitals, elder care facilities, and hospitality. Well, clearly, hospitality is not a career to go into right now during a pandemic, but there are nursing homes, elder care facilities, and hospitals that are hiring and need staff. They do competitive integrated employment type jobs. Essentially, their final school year is a job training program on site for 9 months. They do 3 different internships over the course of the 9 months. Over 70% of those individuals are able to get competitive integrated employment. That means a real job at a real wage, doing great work at the end of that program. So I'm a huge fan of these kinds of programs because they send the dozen young people along with a job coach. There are state governments that have done a magnificent job bringing Project Search into state government. to work in state capitals and other places. So you can be in touch with Erin Riley, their CEO of Project Search, if you're interested in doing it in your state. It's great because a job coach goes with a dozen young professionals and brings them to a job site where they're learning skills. I will say that we're dealing with a time where there's been incredible job displacement. And these kinds of creative programs that bring a dozen job seekers to a job site and let them on the job learn skills can be a great way to help address these barriers. Also believe that at this moment, it's going to be very important for the state to step up its efforts on entrepreneurialism to help people start businesses from home where they can work in safety away from the virus. Thank you. Next question.
What advice would you give to managers who have limited resources but would like to undertake action-oriented program initiatives, specifically those targeting outreach, recruitment, retention activities, mainly recruitment, and how to correct those problem areas in their personnel processes and support services for staff with disabilities? And then there's another question that goes with this that I will ask you after you address that.
So I think the steps that I gave you in my presentation gave you some easy ideas that you can start with. I think it's good to have a conversation, to start to talk to people, say, hey, I'm interested in learning about how we can do a better job and helping you do a better job. Don't see an accommodation as doing somebody a favor. Understand that when you accommodate somebody's disability, and by the way, most disabilities are very easy to accommodate, very inexpensive to do it. It might be something like flex time, for example. It might be helping somebody get access to a desk that is a slightly different height because they have a chronic pain in their back. And if they type standing at a standing desk, which you can get these things you put on top of a desk very inexpensively, that you can help reduce chronic pain significantly for people. You start having these conversations, you find that most of these problems can be solved very, very simply, very inexpensively, and it can really, really help the performance of your employees. So you wind up being much, much more productive as a team. But go to the askjan.org website and really drill down there. They'll give you a lot of really specific ideas.
Okay, the follow-up to that was, can we ask Jennifer to discuss the interactive process and what employers can do to successfully navigate that process?
I don't know what you mean by the interactive process, but I always say that a open door policy is really good. That you let all your employees know that and understand that that their success in terms of being accommodated is this results in the success of your whole agency and organization and your ability to deliver on behalf of taxpayers as a public service organization, that when they can deal with chronic pain or mental health or whatever their disabilities are, that enables them to be a more productive worker and enables you as a state agency to be able to do better to serve the public. And so make sure they understand they can come to you and ask in confidence for accommodations. But one thing that you can really do is you can just start sending out. There are so many off the internet, off the shelf solutions on wellness, mindfulness, how to deal with stress during the pandemic. You should be sending that kind of content out all the time. You also may want to have some social hours, the non-alcoholic happy hour on Zoom to help create, and you can do that during the workday on work hours, just social time. Like you could bring people together to talk about their favorite movie, to do some team building, to sort of really, get people to feel more comfortable in this environment. I have a lot of concerns about mental health. We're seeing real spikes in suicide iteration. We're seeing spikes in behavioral health in terms of alcoholism and drug issues. We're seeing spikes in physical domestic violence. And so the more you can be on top of that proactively by sending out some some ways that people can manage their anxiety and stress, the better off you're going to be. And also, I do think support groups around behavioral health issues like addiction or anger management in the home are going to be important things to do for your own employees.
That's great. That's very important. I saw a report recently that said suicide has gone from being up 400% to up 500%, and domestic violence, especially with people who are working from home, is up over 300%, and that's frightening. To follow up on what you just shared, it said that the biggest barrier people with disabilities encounter are other people. And that's despite the fact that everyone knows that disability discrimination is unlawful. Can you please speak about that and the importance of disability etiquette in society and in the workplace?
Sure. I mean, we're going through an evolution in thinking. I mean, you think about some of the people who were considered heroes in this nation, and a lot of people didn't realize, look, people didn't realize, too many people didn't realize that George Washington had slaves. People didn't realize even that Thomas Jefferson had slaves. People say Black Lives Matter, and then other people say all lives matter. Well, all lives didn't matter when we said all things or all people are created equal back when our country was started, right? All didn't mean all back at the beginning of our Constitution and our democracy. All meant if you were a white man, particularly if you're a property owner. Didn't mean women had the right to vote, didn't mean African Americans were free, from slavery. So we're going through a rapid evolution. People are starting to learn about these things, and hopefully we will see some really big behavioral changes. But also there was a eugenics movement, which is the elimination of people who were unwanted. Planned Parenthood, ironically, a lot of people champion Planned Parenthood today, and people have views pro and con abortion. But Sanger, who formed Planned Parenthood, thought that there should be less African American babies, less Black babies, and also thought, frankly, that people with disabilities should be eliminated. And if you know somebody's going to have a baby with Down syndrome, you should eliminate that baby. And in fact, in Western democracies, the majority of women carrying a baby with Down syndrome do abort. It's eugenics. There's a big evolution from eugenics to the medical model of thinking that everybody should cure people with disabilities, just like we were going to cure homosexuality decades ago. Oh, gay isn't something you're born with, it's something you learn. We should cure that, right? As opposed to accept. And now we understand people are born gay or born, with whatever sexual orientation, identity, you don't want to fix them, you want to accept them. Same is true with disability. If it's something that it's progressive and it's a disease, you want to cure it. If it's something, that's interfering and you want to find an accommodation or workaround. But if somebody has autism or somebody, has a lot of disabilities, like I'm dyslexic, it's a part of who I am. Accept me for who I am. You don't need to cure my dyslexia. You need to recognize I need spell check on my computer because I cannot spell a word properly without it. You need to recognize that somebody needs to check over my math because I can't tell the difference between the number 18 and the number 81 sometimes because of my dyslexia. So on a team, you wouldn't make me the first person that's go-to to do the math. So really, you just need to accept people and let them be their authentic 360-degree self.
What do you think is the next major hurdle or disability employment issue that will have to be addressed to improve employment opportunities even more for people with disabilities?
Well, clearly this pandemic, we were talking about a virus that if you get can be very, very problematic. Even if you live through getting COVID, it can have lifelong health consequences. So, the ability to work from home is really, really important. And so not everyone has access to internet. We're going into a school year where a lot of kids are going to need to learn on their computers. What if they don't have access to internet? What if they don't have a computer screen? What if there's 3 kids, but only 1 computer screen in the home and the parent needs it for their job? These issues about access to internet, access to devices, access to the ability to learn how to use those devices, tutorials for how to use Zoom, making sure that you put, we have on our website, by the way, how to make your online events accessible. Very important to do in terms of live captioning, for example. I'm a huge proponent in live captioning. I think that you should do it as often as possible. Some web programs do it instantly, automatically. I personally prefer Zoom, where you have to hire an outside captionist to do it with you, but it works very, very well, not that expensive, because people who have different kinds of learning styles, even if they're not deaf, if they see the words on the screen, sometimes it helps them remember the information better. And if somebody is an English language learner, like maybe they're Hispanic and they came from Mexico because they were helping with agriculture in North Carolina, and now they've stayed, having both the sound of the words and the ability to see the words will help their retention of the words and will help their success. So I am a really big fan of putting captions on all meeting opportunities and all videos.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and it says, anticipated stigmatization creates more challenges and barriers to employment and an inclusive work environment. What work is being done to help people with disabilities overcome this anticipation?
So Respectability, our nonprofit, works very intentionally in Hollywood, where we're working with ABC, Disney, Netflix, NBC, Sony, and others to help create new content that will show diverse people with disabilities for people who can be successful. If you haven't seen the movie on Netflix called Crip Camp, I hope you will do it. If you have kids or grandkids, I hope they're watching The Healing Power of Dude on Netflix, which is stars 13-year-old Sophie Kim, who is an Asian girl with who uses a wheelchair, and she's so talented, and about a young boy who has an anxiety condition. So there's a lot we're doing in Hollywood to try and reduce those stigmas. The TV series Born This Way that was on A&E Network, and it's now on demand. So a lot can be done there. I really invite you to go to the Respectability website. It's respectability.org. We have free programs all week from 1 o'clock until 3 o'clock. They will later be posted on our website so that you can see them at a time that is convenient to you. There's a whole 2-hour section on workforce coming up later this week that I think you would find hopefully very helpful. You have to be intentional when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about putting numbers in seats. You know, you don't want to hire one Black person and make them your token. You don't want to hire one disabled person and make them your token. You need to make it an inclusive culture and across the board. There's a lot of ways of doing that. And I hope you'll go to our website where we have all these free training seminars and that you will find it helpful. I think it's fantastic that Governor Cooper has been a leader on disability. He recognized National Disability Employment Month with a proclamation in the fall, this past fall. He had the statement today on the ADA. I think that's fabulous. There are states doing wonderful intentional work. I want to highlight something called the Better Bottom Line that the National Governors Association put out on how states can do this. Also, the Council on State Governments put on a report on how states can do this very, very well. North Carolina, my proud home state, where I was born and raised, can be one of the best on this if it gets really serious and intentional, and I hope that it will. And the fact that you're doing this today and that you've joined me today gives me tremendous optimism that you have what it takes and that you're going to make this a success, and that the world and North Carolina and the people in North Carolina will be so much stronger, better, more inclusive because of the success of you, the HR professionals who are on the front lines of making this a more inclusive and successful society. Thank you for having me with you today for this ADA celebration. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it back over to Wendy, but I hope that we will be able to interact with you again in the future. This has been wonderful and highly informative. Wendy,
Thank
do
you
you
so
have
much.
any closing remarks?
Thank you, Gina. I just wanted to again thank Jennifer for her time and thank her organization for coming out today. Jennifer did give a ton of very good resources for us to use. I will be sending out all of the the PowerPoint presentation and her bio out after following the presentation today. I'm going to see also if Nancy, if you have something you would like to state before we conclude.
Yeah, just very briefly wanted to thank everyone for being here today, and particularly to thank Jennifer for taking the time to facilitate and share with us her breadth of experience and knowledge about the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is clearly something the state of North Carolina and Governor Cooper is taking very, very seriously. So we look forward to working with advocates like Jennifer, as well as state agencies, as we partner to continue to try to advance the status of individuals with disabilities as employees for the state of North Carolina and create a work environment and a work culture that makes the state and a model employer for individuals with disabilities. So again, a very big thank you for Jennifer for her time and efforts today to be here with us and to share this very valuable information. And also a big thank you from the Office of State Human Resources, both to Jennifer and also to each of you for taking the time here today to share in this information, educate ourselves, and work together as we move forward. So, and Wendy and Gina, thank you both also for all the work that you've done to make this event a success today and a successful presentation to support the Americans with Disabilities Act, and happy anniversary to it as the 30th anniversary. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and this will conclude our presentation for the day. Again, I will be sending out a copy of the PowerPoint, and this event was recorded, so you can go and look at this event probably starting later on this week. But we will get the event out there for you. Again, thank you very much to Jennifer Mizrahi and her organization, Respectability. And hopefully, everyone will have an opportunity to check out her website and participate with her organization in doing planning to recruit and retain individuals and employees with disabilities. Again, thank you and have a good day.